Episode 11, Worlds Before Columbus, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. It's early October, cross-country season's starting to wind down, and I'm realizing I've only got a couple more races left. Practices are getting colder, the sun's setting earlier, and honestly, it feels like everything's speeding up a little. And I guess that kind of fits what we're talking about today, because it seems like around this time in history, things are about to speed up in a big way, too. So before Europeans start exploring all over the place, what does the world actually look like?
That's exactly the right question, Miles. Before Europeans begin their voyages of exploration, they are not the center of the global economy. Instead, they are on the edge of a much larger system we call the Afro-Eurasian trade world.
And that phrase is important. Afro-Eurasian trade world. It refers to a network that connects Africa, Europe, and Asia through trade. Goods, people, and ideas are constantly moving, but Europe is not in charge of that system.
So Europe isn't leading yet?
Not at all. The most important trade networks are centered elsewhere, especially in the Indian Ocean and across overland routes like the Silk Road. One more piece we should add here is the role of Islam in this system. From the 7th century onward, the spread of Islam helps knit together large parts of the Indian Ocean world.
Muslim merchants from places like the Middle East and North Africa are incredibly important. They travel between regions, establish trading communities, and share a common language and legal traditions that make trade easier and more predictable.
So Islam is kind of helping connect the system?
Exactly. It creates a shared cultural and commercial framework that supports long-distance trade.
And that helps explain why Europeans often rely on Muslim intermediaries. They're not just in the system, they're central to it. The Indian Ocean trade system is one of the most important parts of this world. It connects regions like China, India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa.
That's a huge area. How are people actually traveling across it?
The key is something called monsoon winds. These are predictable seasonal wind patterns that allow sailors to travel across the ocean at certain times of the year and return at others.
So it's not random, it's planned?
Exactly. Merchants time their voyages based on the winds, which makes long-distance trade more reliable.
And because of that reliability, you get thriving port cities all around the Indian Ocean. Places like Calicut in India or ports along the Swahili coast in East Africa. These are cosmopolitan places where merchants from different cultures, religions, and languages interact regularly.
What kinds of goods are moving through this system?
High-value goods mostly. Spices like pepper and cinnamon, silk from China, porcelain, precious stones, and textiles. These are goods that can survive long-distance transport and still be worth a lot of money at the end.
And that's important culturally. These goods become symbols of wealth and status in places like Europe. Owning spices or silk isn't just practical. It signals that you're connected to this wider world.
Are these controlled by empires like in Europe?
Not usually. That's what makes this system interesting. No single empire dominates the Indian Ocean trade world. Instead, merchants rely on trust networks, family ties, religious connections, and shared commercial practices.
India plays a central role here. It's geographically positioned between East Asia and the Middle East, so it becomes a kind of hinge in the system. Goods pass through Indian ports as they move across the ocean.
So it's like a middle point in the system?
Exactly.
Meanwhile, overland trade routes like the Silk Roads connect East Asia to the Middle East and Europe. These routes become especially secure under the Mongols, who unify a vast territory and actively protect merchants.
That political stability matters. When the Mongols reduce conflict across Central Asia, trade becomes safer and more frequent, which increases the flow of goods and ideas.
So political stability actually boosts trade?
Exactly. It's a direct cause and effect relationship.
Is that where Marco Polo comes in?
And this is something you can actually see today. When I take students to Venice, we stop at a building called the Palazzo Mastelli del Camello. It has stone reliefs with carved camels on the outside.
Camels in Venice?
Exactly. And that's the point. It's a visual reminder that Venice was deeply connected to long-distance trade routes like the Silk Roads. Those camels represent connections to the overland trade networks of Asia.
It's a great example of how these global trade systems weren't abstract. They shaped the culture and identity of European cities.
That's actually really cool. So you can literally see the Silk Road connections in European architecture.
Exactly. Marco Polo is a Venetian merchant who travels to Asia and writes about his experiences. His descriptions of places like China help shape European ideas about the wealth and complexity of the East.
So Europeans already know there's wealth out there, they just don't have direct access?
That's a good way to put it. European merchants often have to go through intermediaries, especially Muslim traders, to get goods like spices, silk, and luxury items.
Does that make things more expensive?
Yes, every step in the trade chain adds cost. By the time spices reach Europe, they are extremely expensive. That's one of the biggest motivations for exploration, cutting out those middlemen.
And those intermediaries are not just economic actors, they're also cultural brokers. They connect different parts of the world, but they also control access to knowledge and goods.
What about China? It sounds like it's really important in this system.
It is. China is a major economic power. During the Ming Dynasty, it experiences population growth, urbanization, and strong demand for trade goods like spices.
And China also sends out its own expeditions under an admiral named Zheng He.
I've heard that name before. What does he actually do?
Zheng He leads massive naval expeditions between 1405 and 1433. These voyages travel across the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as East Africa with enormous fleets.
Are they trying to conquer places?
Not really. These voyages are more about diplomacy and prestige. They're meant to demonstrate China's power and build tribute relationships, not to establish colonies.
But after these voyages, China turns inward and stops sponsoring large-scale expeditions. That decision will matter later when Europeans begin expanding outward.
So while China is stepping back, Europe is about to step forward?
Exactly.
So if I'm putting this together, there's already this huge, really advanced global trade system, but Europe is kind of stuck on the edge of it.
That's exactly right, Miles.
And that tension, wanting access to that system but not controlling it, is what drives exploration.
So what changes? Why do Europeans suddenly start exploring?
There are several factors. One major motivation is economic. Europeans want direct access to Asian goods without relying on intermediaries.
So they're trying to make trade cheaper and more direct?
Yes, and more profitable. If you can sail directly to the source of spices or textiles, you can make enormous profits.
There's also a religious motivation. Many European rulers see exploration as a way to spread Christianity.
That connects to what we talked about with the Reconquista, right?
Yes, the Reconquista, the long effort by Christian kingdoms in Iberia to reclaim territory from Muslim rule, helps shape a mindset of expansion and religious mission.
And that mindset is reinforced by the Catholic Church. Popes issue statements known as papal authorizations that grant European rulers the right to conquer non-Christian lands and even enslave non-Christians.
So religion is being used to justify expansion.
Exactly.
What about politics?
Political competition is another major factor. Emerging centralized states like Portugal and Spain are looking for ways to increase their power, wealth, and prestige.
Exploration becomes a way to compete with rival states. If one kingdom finds a new trade route or source of wealth, others will try to follow.
What about knowledge? How do they even know where to go?
Europeans rely in part on classical texts like Ptolemy's geography, which provides a framework for understanding the world.
Is it accurate?
Not entirely. It underestimates the size of the Earth and overestimates how far Asia extends. But it still gives Europeans confidence that ocean travel is possible.
And alongside that, they're developing new technologies that make exploration more practical.
What kind of technologies are we talking about?
One key innovation is the caravel, a small, highly maneuverable ship that can travel long distances and handle ocean conditions.
Did Europeans come up with all of this on their own?
That's a really important question, Miles, because the answer is no. Many of the technologies that make European exploration possible actually come from outside Europe.
The lateen sail, which allows ships to sail against the wind, has origins in the Indian Ocean world. The magnetic compass comes from China. The astrolabe is developed and refined in the Islamic world. And advanced mathematics used for navigation also comes through contact with scholars in the Islamic world.
So in a lot of ways, European exploration depends on knowledge and technologies developed in the Islamic world, India, and China, and transmitted through trade networks.
So even the ability to explore is kind of borrowed from the same trade world they're trying to get into?
Exactly. European expansion is built on earlier global connections. It doesn't appear out of nowhere.
So they're using this new technology to make navigation and sailing easier?
Exactly, and Portugal takes the lead early on.
Why Portugal specifically?
Geography plays a role. Portugal has a long Atlantic coastline and experience with maritime trade. Winds along the coast actually help push ships south toward Africa and then back toward Europe.
And Portugal also has leadership willing to invest in exploration. Prince Henry, often called Henry the Navigator, supports voyages down the African coast.
And this is another place you can connect it to the real world. When I take students to Lisbon, we travel down to Sagres and visit the Fortaleza de Sagres, a fortress associated with Prince Henry's operations.
So that's like his base?
That's how it's often understood. It's a strategic location on the southwestern tip of Portugal, looking out over the Atlantic. Standing there, you can really see how Portugal is positioned to launch voyages down the African coast and into the ocean.
It reinforces the idea that geography, state support, and access to knowledge all come together in one place to make exploration possible.
And there's an earlier moment that matters here too. In 1415, the Portuguese capture the North African city of Ceuta. That gives them direct exposure to African trade networks and helps spark further exploration.
Is he actually sailing on these trips?
Not usually. He's more of a sponsor, organizing, funding, and encouraging exploration.
Under his influence, Portuguese sailors begin exploring the Atlantic islands like Madeira and the Azores and establishing early sugar plantations there.
Sugar plantations? That sounds familiar.
It should. These early plantations rely on enslaved labor and become a model that will later be used in the Americas.
The Portuguese also established trading posts, sometimes called factories, along the African coast, like at Arguin.
Are they taking over those regions?
Not at first. They are inserting themselves into existing trade networks, trading with African rulers for gold, slaves, and other goods.
And in many cases, African rulers are equal partners in these exchanges, at least early on.
So this isn't full conquest yet.
Correct. That comes later.
Over time, Portuguese sailors push farther south. In 1487, Bartholomew Dias rounds the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope.
That's a big moment, right?
It is. It proves that a sea route to the Indian Ocean is possible.
Then, in 1498, Vasco da Gama completes the journey to India, reaching the port of Calicut.
So now Europeans finally have direct access to Asian trade?
Yes, and that changes everything. It allows Europeans to bypass traditional trade routes and enter the Indian Ocean system directly.
Do they just fit into the system like before?
Not for long. At first, they are outsiders, but they will increasingly try to control trade through force.
So this is the beginning of something much bigger.
Exactly.
So today we've got this big global trade network, the Afro-Eurasian trade world, where Europe is kind of on the outside. And then we start to see the reasons Europeans want in: money, religion, competition, and new technology. And by the end, Portugal has figured out a way to reach Asia by sea. In episode 12, we'll look at the conquest of the Americas and the dramatic impact European expansion had on the societies of the New World. Thanks for listening to the Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions.